Dr. Manmohan Singh, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I would also like to thank the organizers, Dr. Mohinder Singh in particular, for inviting me to give this lecture in memory of someone whom we all respected, liked, and regarded as a close friend. I have chosen to speak about education, and that was one of his special concerns. Although he was, of course, a professor of literature, very interested in literature, but the general notion of education was a matter of great consequence to him. I shall touch on the ideas that we occasionally discussed and which I think he would have wanted to see debated more fully in the best academic tradition of assessing the feasibility of these ideas. And it is in that sense that I am bringing them up again. I first met Professor Amrik Singh and his wife Sherry when I joined the famous Bhargav Municipal College in Shimla in 1951 to read for the BA Honours. Graduating from Punjab University was for me a form of touching base because I had not lived in Punjab since my childhood. But for my extended family, Lahore was home, where college-going siblings and cousins were educated. So I had grown up on stories of Aitchison and Kinnaird College, of Government College, of FC College. And there was a degree of familiarity then with the background of some of the teachers at BM College who had come from Lahore, as had Professor Amrik Singh. Later in the 1960s, Professor Amrik Singh and I were both teaching at Delhi University, and we met occasionally and talked about university matters. Our conversations actually ranged from his concerns, very genuine concerns at that time, about the future of Punjabi intellectual culture after the partition of 1947, to the form and function of universities in India. He wrote on how the University Grants Commission should have been playing a more decisive role both in determining educational policy and in encouraging universities to develop new ways of thinking. Universities tended to become clones of a single model inherited from colonial times, rather than institutions exploring knowledge and not just passing on what was known. Many of these basic problems of university education that we discussed in the 60s still remain. They probably will continue unless we determine it otherwise. The initial pressure of larger numbers of students is now spiraling out uncontrollably with little backup of qualified faculty. That the hub of a university is a well-equipped library and up-to-date laboratories is often not seen as fundamental when priority is given, as frequently, to the administration buildings. Hostels are also crucial and make another kind of difference. Where such approaches are not clarified, then, with a few exceptions, there is inevitably a falling in standards, which is now lamented quite frequently. Nevertheless, there are, almost in defiance, pockets of excellence. A tiny percentage of bright teachers and students become prized professionals. Given the natural potential, the percentage could be much higher. Most students these days are expected to grapple with grades rather than with ideas. Relatively less is done to peg schooling to decent, leave alone high standards. If that could be done, then the students admitted to colleges would be more prepared for the tertiary level, the level of college and university. We could move well beyond the colonial inheritance and reformulate our educational needs in accordance with our aspirations to social improvement. Many are concerned about these matters, but little effective change is made. It seems to me that no government has been seriously, but really seriously, committed to a systematic agenda of establishing and improving education. Are we caught between what we have inherited from colonial times, which requires desperate re-examination, and the current populist ideological drives that are pushing us away from quality education? Quoting the increase in the number of schools, colleges, and universities doesn't tell us much about the criteria that go into the making of education. Improvement would lie in providing every Indian with some degree of comprehension of the world that he or she lives in. Part of the problem is also the increasing interference from non-professionals in the contents and institutions of education. Institutions can be easily undermined by controlling the content of what is taught and by appointing incompetent administrators who unravel what has been carefully built up. Political and religious organizations have demanded deletions in the content of syllabi, reading lists, and textbooks, and at another level, they intervene in appointments. It started 4 decades ago, but has accelerated rapidly in recent times. Unfortunately, many academics, even if they are aware of it, are often hesitant to resist it. A violent agitation, not so long ago, by a group of students claiming that an item in a syllabus hurt their sentiments, resulted in the Academic Council removing the item, despite its importance to teaching the subject. The university recognizes the threat from groups with political backing, but does it also recognize the intellectual damage of conceding such demands? This is precisely where decision through debate is called for. In much earlier times, the better vice-chancellors tackled these problems and found ways of disallowing such interference. But in very recent years, some vice-chancellors and administrative heads have other ambitions. Universities have 4 components: teachers, students, the administration, and the financier. In the best universities of the world, the financier, whether the state or a private organization, is disallowed from intervening in academic matters. But since the roots of our university system lie in colonial governance, we have become accustomed to allowing interference by those who claim to be in authority. This was warned against as early as the time of Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, who had stated, and I quote, "Higher education is undoubtedly an obligation of the state, but state aid is not to be confused with state control over academics and over academic policies and practices," unquote. University administration should ideally be the function of keeping the machinery working, but not claiming primacy in academic matters, irrespective of who in the administration is trying to assert this primacy. The crucial core of the university, then, should be those who teach and those who learn. This core is meant to be concerned with what is taught as required information and with learning how to explore knowledge through new ideas and methods. At the broadest level, the intention was and is to produce an educated public and therefore responsible citizens. At a more specific level, to support the advance of knowledge. To provoke new thinking and, where necessary, to dissent from conventional thinking is axiomatic to this process. It is foundational to a university that it be the required space that nurtures freedom of thought. This has been the essential condition of the best universities anywhere in the world, resulting in research that has advanced our understanding and knowledge of the world, and in every field. Autonomy is the essence of the functioning of universities, and they have to protect their right as being places where there is freedom to think, to speak, and to debate. Is this the spirit that guides our universities today? Whether in the primary and secondary schools that lay the foundations of education or in tertiary education, the planning and the funding could have been more adequate and more focused. State universities struggle with paucity of funds and facilities. It is thought that the alternative could be private colleges and universities. But for some private investors, quite a few, education has become an industry. Colleges and universities are sometimes run more as factories than faculties, and the central issue is investment and profit. Economics takes over, and such places are seldom open to the most meritorious unless they can rustle up the enormous fees required. Are these alternatives giving us qualified specialists and responsible citizens? Educational institutions are not static. They change when societies change. The minimum is that the educated should be trained to understand the world they live in through the knowledge that they receive, to have the confidence to question the system where this questioning is needed, and to work towards claiming their rights as citizens of a reasonably well-ordered society. Democracy is meant to enable people to change from being subjects of the state to becoming citizens of the state with rights and obligations. Citizenship of a democracy should mean equal access to social justice and to human rights, given unanimously and universally. No category of citizen has priority over others. What we have today is a citizenry of which almost 50%, who for no fault of their own remain effectively without education. And this lack and its general acceptability is a reflection on how poorly we define our democracy. Perhaps we need to return again to two themes that have cropped up in past times, have been discussed. They remain undecided and therefore prevent the shaping up of the program for education. One is the question of relating the content of education to its purpose and function, and the other is the tangled question of the language of instruction at various levels. We treat the purpose and function of education rather casually. Its budget is paltry to begin with. Nevertheless, it's the one budget that meets with constant cuts, education being treated as dispensable. Of the population, barely half can claim to be educated, and many of these minimally so. In most schools where science is taught without conducting experiments, or geography without maps, such teaching has little value other than providing cursory information. Yet, if quality education were to be available to larger numbers, it would result in many more competent people facilitating economic development and social change, hopefully towards the society that we aspire to. In order to discover this potential from hitherto uneducated sections of society, obviously, there has to be universal education that goes beyond the lowest common denominator. That this is not happening makes one wonder whether political parties feel threatened by the thought of an educated electorate. Education is not just for the market. It is central to understanding the world we live in and our relation to it, as well as to inculcating the values that benefit human interaction. For all our talk about having inherited a great civilization, we are the least concerned with giving priority to quality education. And that was what largely contributed to the making of this great civilization in the past. Yet the irony these days, and to call it irony is to put it very politely, the irony these days is that half the population that has been kept barely literate, or not at all, is called upon to digitize its way of life and behave like highly educated citizens. Are we missing something in not realizing that education needs to precede all this? After all these years, we remain among the countries with the lowest rate of literacy. Yet even literacy is not the test of an educated population. It is only the initial step. There are other components of education of which I shall discuss two as essential. To put it simply, one is access to knowledge, and the other is the communication of that knowledge. Access to knowledge and communication. Access to knowledge requires correct information on the subject taught, updated by questioning existing information. This could begin with knowing about the world we live in and how we relate to the cultures of our neighbors, for instance. Creating curiosity is a major step in the educational process. But we show scant interest even in what is being discussed by our neighbors. To take the simplest example, when did we last make a serious study of curricula in schools and universities in neighboring countries? Yet what is taught in these countries would tell us about their self-perception and their attitudes to neighbors, and we are one of them. Our neighbors also experience controversies on what should be included in textbooks and argue about why. Controversies that should be of great interest to us since they parallel our controversies. A study of educational programs would tell us much about how we see ourselves and how others see us. And it's important to know how others see us. The quality of education is not determined only by the amount of information acquired by students. More important is whether they have been taught to think critically about the information. Are students familiar with the process of what is called critical inquiry, so essential to every form of education? It applies to each subject of study and to virtually every human activity. It begins with asking questions, the answers to which are statements on the subject being inquired into, and these in turn can be questioned and analyzed. A simple explanation of what is a logical statement and what is not can be a start. This does mean, of course, that teachers themselves must understand what is meant by critical inquiry. A more purposive beginning may be made by first teaching the teachers. And who better than knowledgeable teachers to do this training? This does not require an extensive financial outlay, which is always the pat excuse for doing nothing. Teachers have in any case to be trained, and textbooks written for teaching. The teacher can be trained to ask questions, to think critically, and be familiar with methods of inquiry, instead of stopping with merely handing out information. And textbooks should both inform and encourage students to ask questions about what they are learning. Textbooks are amongst the most difficult pedagogic tools to write. And yet, it is amazing how we, by and large, allow all kinds of nonsense to pass as textbooks. This would require an extensive and transparent commitment to conveying knowledge and to also explaining its social value on the part of those advancing education. Better trained teachers may also result in their receiving much more respect than they are currently given. Let me try and explain what I mean by critical inquiry and why I think that that is the essence of education. Learning and the acquisition of knowledge is incomplete unless there is an awareness of the method of inquiry that is used to prize out knowledge. This has to be taught as a process of thinking, and one that is relevant to all subjects. It assumes the freedom to ask questions and to direct questions that enhance the inquiry. Such training helps in another way. Every inquiry involves assessing the validity of suggested explanations, how things happen. But all explanations do not have equal validity. So giving priority to some involves a selection and an explanation of why some are selected and others rejected. This involves critical inquiry. The method draws on common sense. It starts with collecting data and ascertaining the reliability of the data. Some fantasy may intervene in this process, but fantasy has to be differentiated from evidence. Causal connections necessary to theories of explanation draw largely on logical argument and rational thought. But perhaps the occasional leap of imagination may be permitted if it illumines the argument. New discoveries, both of information and of new methods of analyzing it, are happening continuously. Consequently, the range of sources of knowledge expands. As a result, existing information has to contend with the new and be changed. Let me try and demonstrate this from my own specialization in ancient history, which might make my argument a little clearer. There was a time when a source consisted of what was said in a text. So Herodotus, popularly described as the father of history, the Greek writer Herodotus, was accused by a few of his contemporaries of incorporating gossip into his history. They said that he used hearsay as evidence. And hearsay, as we all know, is not evidence. The same accusation was made of some of the chronicles of Indian royal courts. Nevertheless, until a century ago, narratives from these sources were retold and described as history. But today's historians have to investigate these texts and their contents for reliability before treating them as sources of history. This means checking the text with other sources. If these are limited, we resort to the technique of detectives, and like Agatha Christie, we try and piece together a hypothesis, but without always having a proven solution. The historian, therefore, has to cross-question the text. And this is part of what I mean about the critical inquiry as applied, for example, to a discipline like history. What does cross-questioning the text mean? Asking questions. What was the social intellectual background of the author? His caste, occupation, family, religion, location, and so on. Did his background influence what he wrote? Very important question. What was the historical context of the text? Who read it and why? What was the intention of the text, both overt and covert? In past times, it was enough just to know the language of a text. Now we have to know much more than the language. Specialists in linguistics will tell us about the various dimensions of a language, such as, does one language carry the imprint of another that maybe have been used in the proximity of the first language? For example, some scholars argue that Vedic Sanskrit has elements of Dravidian. This leads to a whole lot of very interesting questions. Another source is a comparison between objects described in a text with those excavated from sites of a comparable date. Roman wine jars found at sites such as Pattanam in Kerala can be compared with descriptions of them in Greek and Tamil sources referring to the trade. Archaeological finds are now examined by various scientific techniques, so the archaeologist is forced to be familiar with the relevant science. For example, the archaeologist tracking settlements on the banks of the river Sutlej in the Punjab has to consult hydrologists since the river changed its course more than once. Where population migrations in history are being studied, as they are now constantly being studied from the ancient to recent periods, there DNA analysis and genetics have become part of the argument. So the historian has to be slightly familiar with what is meant by DNA analysis and genetics. Maritime trade, for example, cannot be explained in detail without technical information on shipping and navigation in past times.